Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast.
So hi, my name is Jonathan Dickstein, and I'm a professor at Arihanta Institute, focused on Jain studies and vegan studies. I'm also the lead organizer for the Vegan Studies Initiative here at Arihanta. I'll be your podcast host for today, and I have the privilege of being able to have a conversation with Jishnu Guha-Majumdar, who is assistant professor of political theory in the political science department at Butler University. Jishnu is teaching a course for us, course 1020, Foundations of Animal Ethics, which is a course that does this nice bridge between ethics, political science, animals, animal rights, and veganism. So I'm really happy to be here with Jishnu. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Wonderful. And I think some of your background and interests will come out as we talk. But what I'd like to ask first is, how did animals get on your radar at all? Or as I like to say, how did you first get radicalized for animals? And I mean that in the sense that from the position of the status quo, animal rights, animal ethics, animal liberation is a radical position, right? Those within the movement or within those spheres might not consider it radical, but from the perspective of the status quo, these stances and ethics and politics are radical. So how did you first get radicalized for animals?
I think there were a couple of key inflection points for me. One was when I was about 18 or 19 in my first year of college. And retrospectively, I think the combination of two things kind of opened my eyes to the situation of animals as something that was in need of special attention. The first was that kind of a mundane thing, but my mom got cats. I had never had any companion animals growing up. I really wanted them, but my parents never really let me. And then when I went off to college, my mom adopted some cats that she found in her backyard. And I think something about having regular contact with sentient beings and being able to look them in the eye and see and understand their different personalities primed me for an intellectual shift, which came around the same time, which was I had always been involved in debate in high school and college as a debate nerd. And my freshman year of college, the topic was on agriculture. And part of the topic was about animal agriculture. And there was a senior on our team who was vegetarian and had produced a lot of research on animal agriculture. And as a freshman, I just kind of used what the older kids were using and started reading this stuff. And so I just, after a while, I think it just became sort of undeniable to me, the arguments. I couldn't really find a way around them to, consider animal life. I soon after became a vegetarian. And I think I was also, I feel like I was primed a bit before all of this as well. I was, generally sort of have always been kind of a lefty person ever since Bush invaded Iraq. And, I was sort of skeptical a lot of the forces that were producing industrial animal agriculture. I remember I tried to go vegetarian once in high school because we dissected a pig and like a piglet in biology class, and I felt really gross about it. But it just didn't stick. When you don't have control over your own life, it's kind of hard to affect things. But so all that's to say is I think that there was some priming for this sort of intellectual shift that occurred when I was in college. And then I'll just quickly say there's probably a second inflection point, which was when I was in grad school. And I'd gone to grad school to focus on environmental issues. I went to a school that was like very well known for that sort of topic in political science. And I saw it as an extension of my commitments to animal rights. And when I got there, I actually saw that animal issues in particular were still sort of underlooked by my colleagues and friends who were interested in environmental issues. And I felt like there was still, even among those who were critically minded, such a huge gap between the severity of the issue and the amount of attention that was being given to it. And so I felt sort of called to it at that point. And then as these things go, they become self-reinforcing. You become vegan, and then that puts you into certain circles, and then your social life is reinforced by it. And so from then on, I sort of was radicalized. That was about 10 years ago, I'd say.
Very interesting. And so I guess following up on that, maybe it's not really a personal question. I guess it is personal in the sense that I'm curious which part was more challenging. And what I mean by that is that I think there's a first moment. I don't know if the movement towards personal vegetarianism or actually personal veganism, if we're referring that to just this kind of abstentive practice, that's radical in a sense, right? It's not normal, it's not common. Yet there are plenty of people, I think, right, who are vegetarian, who are vegan, who kind of their own individual lifestyle, as it were, but it's not necessarily embedded in their political viewpoint or political practice or something that they insist upon or something that they dedicate their work life to, right? A lot of individuals can do that individually, and then kind of their work life is separate. What you seem to be describing is that first point where you, at a younger age, shift as an undergraduate because you can't personally reconcile, right, the philosophies and then the practice of, say, eating animals. But then later on deciding, like, this is something that is either extremely important in contemporary politics or, and I'm just assuming this a little bit, inextricable from the other kind of politics you're concerned with, whether that's environmental ethics, environmental politics, race politics, class politics, and so on. So I guess that's just like a background to say, what do you think was the hardest? Is that second point of radicalization, do you think, a bit more challenging because it's more public, because it's professional? And then what was the reception of that, I guess, in your immediate community when you made that shift?
I don't know that either of them was more challenging. I sort of see them as existing on a continuum among each other. I think because I've always been politically minded, my personal shift was, it kind of embedded itself in my political worldview. And so I guess one point that I haven't mentioned before was that, or I didn't mention before, was that in college, after becoming vegetarian, I pretty soon after joined our college like animal rights group. And I don't know how effective we were. I mean, we were kind of college kids just trying to figure stuff out and throwing petitions around and stuff, but it was, helpful to be in a community of other politically minded individuals on this issue. So all that's to say is that there was I think sort of I described them as inflection points, but they weren't like, the second point was not a radical break out of nowhere that before I was personal and then suddenly I became political. But so that's one thing. And then the second question you asked was, how was that perceived? Like, was it, harder to take a more public facing stance in my work? And the reaction that I received was, it's sort of like people tend to be on board on a surface level, but I think maybe don't always understand fully the implications of everything and what I'm saying. So I think most people, when they hear that I'm interested in animal issues, there's two kinds of responses that are like, oh, that's cool. And there's two variations of that. So one is like, oh, that's cool. And it's from people who personally feel a similarly deep conviction, but it's also not part of their public work. And so they tend to be very supportive, but they're kind of focused on other things. And then there's people who are like, oh, cool, but they maybe internally don't really think it's all that important compared to, other issues. But it's very rare that I get like oh, that matter, at least in the space of academia. There's some people who are like, oh, that's interesting, but they mean weird. And so the reaction is, I guess, has been varied, but there's a lot of like surface level acceptance and maybe, um, I don't know what's going on a deeper level.
It reminds me of description you have for your course for us, which reads, many sense that something is very wrong in the way that humans treat animals, but also may struggle to articulate why that is the case. And I think this is what you're describing is kind of very similar to maybe when you express that you're vegetarian or vegan. The response you get is one that's, it seems like the social norm is to say that's a good thing. Like I respect that, but it'll not be overly enthusiastic, but not overly critical. And, I would also surmise that it has to do with that at some very root level, we understand that there's something fundamentally wrong, problematic, that in the way that we perceive and treat animals.
I'd agree with that.
So I think that's maybe a nice segue into thinking about I'm using the course as a springboard for a general discussion, but your course for us, Foundations of Animal Ethics, is kind of giving either those interested in philosophy or say even seasoned advocates, activists, kind of grounding and a framework from which to say, understand our moral relationships with animals, our relationships with animals and their moral implications. And also ideally as a tool to help frame, say, rhetoric, language, and strategy, and so on. So you find that this course is kind of important, I think, for all these people, interested in philosophy who don't have animals on their radar, and maybe those interested in animals that don't have philosophy that much on their radar. So why do you think it's so important, this kind of relationship between philosophy or theory and the practice of, say, animal advocacy?
So I like to describe this relationship between theory and practice. I like the metaphor of like an ecology or an ecosystem, in the sense that theory and practice fulfill different niches in the ecosystem, but that can work symbiotically with each other. And so the two niches are reflection and action. So these are not obviously mutually exclusive, but I think different conditions help the two to flourish to their maximal capacity. So reflection sometimes requires stepping back from action, surveying the field, meditating, understanding, not rushing to judgment. Whereas action sometimes requires you to set aside more theoretical, abstract questions, for the exigencies of the moment. And so the way in which I think theory can inform practice is to, if you were to think of two people, one who is all reflection and one person who is all action, the person who only reflects obviously never gets anything done, or maybe they're afraid to act in the world because they are constantly thinking. And the person who only acts without reflecting, is likely to repeat the same patterns or not really understand what they're doing. And so I think reflection can help sort of, which I'm using as a stand-in for theory, can help one more deeply understand the playing field on which one is working. And so I think it is helpful to do so. Now, I don't think everyone needs to be a philosopher, but yeah, like I said, theory can help you understand the history, the broader issues, the kind of abstract contained within the concrete that affects us in everyday life. So, for example, one of the issues one of the approaches in animal ethics that's really big right now is effective altruism, and there's all sorts of debates about effective altruism. But a lot of these debates, and I think we're going to talk about this a little bit, are sort of downstream of debates that have been happening for a long time about utilitarianism, and so understanding the history of that and the full scope of that outside of the sort of like nitty gritty of immediate political action, I think can help inform that political action in a deeper way.
Yes, I agree. And now I'm just on the spot reminded of Aldous Huxley quote, and I think he uses the word metaphysic and not philosophy, and he says that, none of us lives without a philosophy.
Yeah.
Even the dullest among us has a philosophy. So the choice is never between a philosophy and no philosophy. It's a good one and a bad one.
Yeah.
I think that's a paraphrase of the quote. And I say that because even if we use terms like utilitarianism or consequentialism, deontologies kind of sound like big philosophical terms. But when you look at how a lot of individuals make their choices, right? They fluctuate between things like these, between sometimes they're deontologists, sometimes they're utilitarians, sometimes they're actually operating under kind of some vulnerabilities framework that escapes those. And so we'll get into that, but I say that mostly because I agree. I think that we are obviously encultured into certain philosophies, even if they don't carry that kind of capital P philosophy kind of understanding to us immediately. So I just wanted to add to that too, and maybe I'm glad that you brought up something like effective altruism, because I also think that there's a middle term, which is, and this has been common right in animal rights for the last couple of decades, is the history of social movements, right? So you can't just have the right philosophy and say, actually, for example, we shouldn't talk about welfare improvements. We should talk about rights, for example.
Yep.
Well, that might be true in some kind of hypothetical situation, but we also have to look, right? How does change actually take place? How do social movements actually work? And so I also think that between the kind of theory praxis kind of pipeline, as it were, there's also a kind of a history component that I feel like the animal rights movement has only really taken up with a priority in the past couple of decades.
I fully agree. I mean, that's why I'm a political scientist in training, and so I really think that I would call it the historical or the political term is an important third term as well, for sure.
So great. So maybe because the course is not really getting into, well, at least generally a history of social movements or kind of, what's the most effective form of advocacy you could do, but rather this earlier place of reflection, as you call it. And one of the course parts I noticed is on the philosophy of utilitarianism. And I think this is probably one of the most well-known philosophical terms, like in the public, if you just described it or ask someone what it is, maybe they might know what it's about, but maybe a general understanding. And I'm curious if you could just describe it for us. And I'm asking this because I sometimes feel like there is this kind of caricature of what it is when it's laid out in order to dispose of it right away. So I'm not validating the philosophy either, but I'm just curious if you could just inform our audience as to what that term refers to, utilitarianism.
Yeah. So to be very simplistic, I would say, so the two kind of key principles, I would say, number one, it is a version or perhaps subset of a broader ethical approach called consequentialism, which is to say that the way that you judge whether an action is good or bad is based off of its consequences, as opposed to, say, the intentions behind it, or whether or any other thing, right? So so consequentialism would say if you lie to prevent suffering, that's a good action, even though lying in general maybe is what's called deontologically bad, or the sort of intention or purpose behind it is bad. To be very simplistic. So it's a version of consequentialism. And the second principle is that a good action is one that maximizes well-being or pleasure, and a bad action is one that increases suffering or non-flourishing. And so this can be understood as an opposition to, say, the good means acting in accord with some higher order thing like God's will or rationality even, or some, purpose of human or other existence. So it's a very down-to-earth philosophy. But I would say, in addition to these two, which are the most common ways of describing utilitarianism, I think a third feature that is maybe the source of its radicalism, but also the source of much criticism of it, is that I would say that utilitarianism, to some degree, entails quite a radical disregard for what it is like to be X, Y, or Z being, in a sense. So what I mean by that is, for the utilitarian, what matters is, does a being suffer? But other features of it come into play as a secondary consideration. So, for example, whether the being has a particular relationship to you, like your family member or something, matters less than aggregate sort of suffering. And again, it's easy to caricature this. Utilitarians are not like, family doesn't matter or anything like that. But the sort of radicality of utilitarianism is to say, we should really focus in on the pure question of well-being and suffering, almost like units independent of where, like what containers those units are kind of in, right? And so that is radical in a sense. It's very useful for battering down the hatch of anthropocentrism, because anthropocentrism relies on some rarefied conception of what it means to be a human being as this like special concept. And utilitarianism says, well, for ethical purposes, what matters is that human beings suffer just like other sentient beings. And so that is the way that we ought to think about it.
Thank you. And yeah, there's certainly so much there, right? The different kind of types of utilitarianism and this kind of like act utilitarianism, right? The kind of maximization of the good based on individual act, or like a rule-based utilitarianism that's based on like, generally, if everybody follows this will maximize utility, as it were. I think about that because we're on Jain Studies podcast, and I think there's a resonance actually in Jainism, but also you see this across some South Asian traditions, because they sometimes say that bodhisattvas in the Buddhist tradition who are omniscient can sometimes break rules, moral rules that apply to lay people, because they are omniscient, they can break the rule, and that in effect will maximize utility. It'll bring about greater positivity, as it were, than if they hadn't. But because they're omniscient, they can do that. But individuals can't on the fly with non-omniscience make those choices. So they will follow the rule. So they will always say not lie, because they can't have the kind of knowledge and judgment to be making those decisions to lie or not lie just kind of on their own. But anyway, that just kind of, I think there are these, it's not purely this Euro-American philosophical phenomenon. And someone like Charles Goodman has written on consequentialism in Buddhist ethics. Others disagree, but there is that perspective, I think. But anyway, coming back to your point, I kind of, maybe we can emphasize what you touched on within your answer, which is that one of the biggest strengths, right, of these utilitarians, say like Peter Singer, but going back to Bentham and Mill, is that idea that like suffering matters no matter who is the kind of locus of that suffering. And do you still find that to be extremely powerful, say, in contemporary animal ethics and advocacy?
Yeah, I feel ambivalent about it. I think it can be very powerful. I think most animal advocates have some element of this idea within them. The question is to what extent, is it a tactic, or is it like a fundamental or foundational sort of strategy that ought to shape everything else? And we may or may not talk about, Peter Singer takes this idea and doesn't coin, but popularizes this term speciesism to describe the way that people run away from the implications of suffering matters depending on no matter who is suffering, by hiding behind species as a way of disregarding certain forms of suffering. And sort of the basic move that he makes with speciesism is one that I make all the time, right? And it follows in every sort of ethical approach that I talk. At the same time, I think we'll talk about this later, I think I am invested to some degree in the mattering of a who, like of what it is like to be certain types of beings. I think the humanist tradition does so in a bad way that utilitarianism rightly takes down. But I'm sort of the sort of animal ethicist who is sort of invested in relationships and context and vulnerability. And so there are certain ways in which there are often times where I admire the radicality and the willingness of utilitarians to kind of like follow principles to the nth degree and to come to really like important conclusions. And at the same time, I find myself, it's a bit hard to explain all of the reasons why in this format, but I some of the conclusions I draw back from and want to emphasize, that our relationships and who the ethical beings in question does matter. And again, I don't want to paint a caricature of utilitarianism. It's not like utilitarians or like if and I'll just say effective altruists as well. It's not like they are just calculators that only care about that don't care at all about the who of who they're engaging with. They're deeply compassionate people, but yeah, at the margins there are some conflicts. Yeah,
I would agree with all that, and I do find that I think some of the areas that I grapple with in ethics is the kind of, say, priority of proximity and relationships, right? It seems kind of rather odd that I should be coin flipping with respect to someone with whom I have a deep, intimate relationship and say one other person or 1.5 other people elsewhere. And I'm not saying that all utilitarians would do that either. I just say that is a very tricky area. And I think relationality is key with ethics, even if we don't know how to answer it, I think perfectly.
Yeah.
I think there's also a good point that also I think that you raised too, which is this kind of problem of like the aggregate. Like, can we kind of calculate small amounts of like decreases in suffering or small amounts of flourishing, and somehow at some point they trump something else? Looks like, so how many people can we spare from some small thing, and that somehow outweighs, say, a large thing for a smaller group of people? I think these are challenging questions. I think at times like that, and I don't want to get too far into it, I find a little bit of value in what John Rawls used to refer to as lexical priority, this kind of notion that there are certain things of like a categorical difference, like that you can't just add up things of another category and then at some point it tilts the scales. So, and we might not even want a society in which that exists, which also a utilitarian, a proper utilitarian would be concerned with, right? If you say allow, as I said earlier, people to make like decisions on the fly, you might say contribute to society that is unstable in so many other ways, in which case you're actually not even following your own framework. Anyway, it's a little bit of a side quest for me right there, but it was just talking about how I do in many ways see the kind of shortcomings, but there is a way, right? That kind of fundamental anti-anthropocentrism of that kind of like original Benthamite utilitarianism, regardless how he actually lived his life, but seems to still have value.
Yeah, I would say for me personally, utilitarianism was a great battering ram to that provides an initial way to sort of like break through the ramparts of anthropocentrism. It's not the only tool that I would take with me through those walls.
No, I agree. And what you said earlier about context and history, and as we've now been kind of more dialed into the kind of intersectionality of these issues,
right,
and the kinds of sensitivity, histories of colonialism, histories of discrimination, histories of capitalism. So do you think there are what other approaches to animal ethics do you think are handy, as you say, besides just that battering ram?
Yeah, so there's two broad approaches that have a number of sub-schools within them that I would point students towards or point listeners towards. The first one is a rights-based, or kind of, you could call it like a neo-Kantian approach. And this is most famously associated with Tom Regan, but there are really interesting developments more recently that take this in a more politically theoretical direction from Will Kimmelka and Sue Donaldson and a bunch of other people. But the rights critique of utilitarianism is kind of about sacrifice, that the argument is that utilitarianism enables the sacrifice of individuals. So for sacrificing one for the greater good of all, and that is wrong for a variety of reasons. And so for this sort of approach, there's something special about subjective experience. There's something special about being kind of a being that with purpose, a being that has ends that matter to it, that it pursues, that have significance for it, that are not reducible to just the sheer calculation of suffering or pleasure. And so for the rights-based approach, there ought to be protective circles drawn around that subjective experience for which that individual should not be sacrificed, even if it leads to the greater good of all. And so Tom Regan very famously applies this to animals and says, this approach has traditionally been used to defend the sanctity of human life, but he introduces this category called subject of a life, which is to say the sort of like broader category of a being with a purpose that has, there's sort of significance to it. And then future philosophers or future contemporary philosophers like Christine Korsgaard have taken this up as well. And so, yeah, that's one approach, a rights-based approach.
If I can just interject here, just because I don't want to have to come back too far, is that also, right? And then seeing how tricky things get, then when we start to talk about the rights-based approach within that, who is enfolded, right, as having this little fence around them, right, this protective fence. Right. And, Tom Regan has his description of a subject of a life, but then there seems to be individuals later that said, actually, that's like too robust of a standard of a hurdle, like, because it wasn't just sentience, as it were. But then you have people like Alistair Cochrane and others who have focused more on, and Singer, of course, on sentience itself.
Yes.
And then even beyond that, right, more recent literature in environmental ethics, it seems, at least, folks like Ronald Sandler at least talk about actually maybe sentience itself is too robust of a standard. Yeah. So do you think those kind of other discussions really, really matter for animal ethics and animal advocacy? Or is there somewhere we can stay where it just doesn't get too, how would I say, too far away, where now we're actually maybe not talking about animals anymore, we're talking about microbes, or we're talking about, other, say, non-animal organisms?
Yeah, this is I think a lively point of debate in contemporary animal and environmental ethics. So first is, yes, I want to acknowledge that there's a diversity of approaches. Like the rights-based framework itself is this big umbrella, but then where the line is drawn actually produces quite radical differences within the rights-based framework. I do think this question of how far the line for rights extends is an important one, and I don't really have an answer to the question of where the line ought to be drawn. I don't have a solution to this, but my own research is like interested in this as a problem, like not as resolving the problem, but interested in the problem itself. Yeah, I guess all I'll say is I do think it's important. It's important for also navigating the relationship between the animal rights movement and the ecology movement, which should be natural allies, but aren't always. So yeah, I do think it's important.
All right. So you were about to also pivot to another framework.
Yeah, and a third framework I would just broadly describe as contextual or relational. And there's a bunch of different ways that this can be approached, but the basic idea here is, whereas the previous approaches find some feature of a being, like is it sentient? Does it suffer? Does it have consciousness? Whatever it may be, it finds some naturalized feature of the being and says, okay, from this basis, we can build a foundation for ethics, and we can determine who we ought to have an ethical relationship to. And the contextual or relational approach kind of flips that emphasis and emphasizes that we always exist in context, that there's no natural feature of another being that can determine once and for all, regardless of context, how we ought to act towards that being or what matters about that being. But that there's something about relation and context that precedes that ethical relationship. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't then think about, sentience and consciousness and all of those things. But it is to say that at bottom, at the root of everything, it's turtles all the way down. It's context and relationship first. And so there's a lot of different ways that this is approached. I think of, there's a school of thought called ecofeminism, and ecofeminism itself is very diverse. But one article that I'm teaching in this class by Laurie Gruen sort of describes ecofeminism as a contextual, fundamentally having a contextual ethics. Cora Diamond, who applies the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein to animal issues, also takes this approach. And then there's another approach called vulnerability ethics, which is similar to utilitarianism in the sense that it focuses on the way that beings suffer rather than their like higher order, quote unquote, higher order capacities. But vulnerability ethics tends to see suffering as kind of a portal to relationality, like we're able to relate to each other because we're suffering incomplete dependent beings, whereas utilitarianism sees suffering as sort of like a naturalized capacity of a being, and that's what matters to it. So these are all different from each other, but they kind of share this contextual umbrella. And then I should say that these aren't the only three ways to describe animal ethics. It's just sort of a convenient way of boxing things up, and that most people and most philosophers often fall in the cracks between these different approaches. So there's a lot of people who are, both takes a rights approach and a contextualist approach. There are people who take a rights approach and a utilitarian approach. The vulnerability ethics thing focuses on suffering in the same way that utilitarianism does, but it spins it off in a kind of different direction. So these aren't like hermetically sealed from each other.
I think that's true. And I think there's also a difference, right, between how, when we hear, like, thank you for that really eloquent description of all three and concise of all three, well, four actually, how we hear that and our initial response to them, and actually how we live our lives.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that sometimes things that seem kind of repugnant or distasteful, or obviously the opposite, we might actually do that in our lives all the time. Or, I sometimes think of rights specifically as rights, especially growing up, say, in the United States. Like, rights is just something you learn about when you're young. You just hear the language of it. But rights are kind of weird things, right?
Yes.
This notion of like especially natural rights. It's very bizarre. It's a very bizarre concept. And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, but I think and then
it's
people,
not as intuitive as we are led to think of it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, utilitarianism, some of those principles, like pain is a bad thing, that's actually something that's quite intuitive. But there are many ways in which later on we find it distasteful for other reasons. So I find it accurate, as you described, that they're not living sealed from one another. I don't think, not only in theory, but also in the way most individuals enter into their lives and live their lives, whether there's animals or non-animals. So with that in mind, because, your course really isn't on veganism per se, but you and I have written about veganism together with a couple colleagues. You recently have a piece called Vegans Are Radical. That's Why We Need Them, that you contributed to Vox. So how do you think maybe veganism fits in with all this? And maybe it's utility, pun intended, and perhaps disutility for, say, animal advocacy or the animal rights movement. Where do you see it fits in here?
Yeah.
Sorry if that's like a big general question, but
yeah. So like, how does it fit into these sort of different approaches to animal ethics? Or
well, I guess first off, right? We're talking about as if these kind of philosophical schools or frameworks are at odds with one another. In a sense, they are, but a lot of individuals from all of them are still arriving at this practice of veganism. So I guess, is that alone a really good reason for us to continue to insist on its theorization and practice? Or as you also write in your article, you cite a lot of the antipathy towards vegans and veganism. So yeah, I guess I wish I had a more like really specific question here, but I guess I'm asking, like, do you think it's a really vital component of thinking about animals today and the animal advocacy movement? Or is it some other aspects, like the history of social movements or a certain kind of intersectional philosophy? Or is it all of them? But I think there's a lot of vegans out there that are always curious, like, where does veganism fit in all this?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. So the short bumper sticker answer is veganism. I think veganism as a political movement or as a political orientation is necessary but not sufficient. So it is needed, but it is not the only thing. And so that's the bumper sticker. The longer way around is that we could traditionally describe two approaches that correspond to the discussion we've been having about like why is veganism or vegetarianism sometimes important. And one answer is consequential. By not eating animals, you prevent the bringing into existence of torturous lives of animals who are not who suffer needlessly and all of that. Then there's a more rights-based argument, which is animals are sentient beings who ought not be property. Animal products are only made possible in the modern world by animals being property. Therefore, we ought abstain as a moral principle, regardless of the consequences of those actions, right? So those are two like sort of maybe not caricatures, but extremes of the way that one could conceive of it. I think of, I draw both the consequentialist and we could call it deontological or principles-based versions of those inform why I think veganism is important. But I would fundamentally think about veganism, I'm a political scientist, I think about it politically. And so there's a third sort of way of thinking about it, which is praxis and solidarity oriented. The article that you and I wrote together was called Veganism as Left Praxis, and we really thought of the word praxis as being important. And so what that means to me is, I guess to put it pithily, there's that old, who is it? I think Upton Sinclair, who says, writing socialism is like, it's hard to convince a person of something if they, are profiting off of it. I forget the exact word. And so I think there's something similar with veganism, which is I think it's hard to think clearly about animal issues if your material bodily practice is invested in their subjugation. And to some degree, the modern world makes it inevitable that our bodies will be invested in that subjugation to some degree, but there are elements that we can control and, take a stand on. And so what's important to me about that is that the public stance and practice of being vegan is important for, I don't think ideas or discussions happen in this ethical philosophical vacuum, but they occur in the crucible of society and history and politics, right? And so, and they occur in the minds of embodied beings. And so we should shape our bodily practice to help us to think and act more clearly with regard to animals. But it's not just on the individual level. In the Spock's article that you cite, I describe veganism as a practice of solidarity, which is to say the entire world is built off of the backs of animals and of their literal flesh and blood. Like, they are the lifeblood. They are literally the lifeblood of the modern world. And that's made possible because of this sort of the externalization of all the costs of this modern world onto them. And so so when we eat meat and animal products, we are, we're living our lives according to the norms of the world, but that world is built off of the backs of these animals. And so to be vegan is to say, the buck stops with me. Like, I will not continue, I know this is the way the world does. The world is violating you, chickens and fish and, all the others. And I will not be a part of that. And so that is, if we're to think of animals as active agents and beings in the world, you can think of veganism as a form of solidarity or as a precondition of solidarity. It doesn't really matter to me, but it sort of has that political valence towards it. And so that's what makes it, I think, necessary but not sufficient, because I think that act of solidarity, I call it like a form of conscientious objection in the piece, is really necessary, but it's in and of itself is not going to kind of get us the goods we need. But I do think it ought to be, the moral compass or the heartbeat of our movements. And so the reason I think what's animating your question is that there are questions nowadays in the animal movement about the extent to which we ought, veganism ought to be promoted, actively promoted as a strategy. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I think this argument is largely a consequentialist argument that says the label turns people off, even if it's the right label or the right thing to do. It has a bad name. People will, turn away from it. They don't like it. And so animals will suffer in the end. And there's something powerful about that argument. But I also think that it misses some component of this political dimension that I was talking about, right? That there ought to be some sort of guiding compass. It's like, well, yes, maybe it's unpopular, but politically, our task as activists and thinkers is to not just react to public opinion, but to shape it. And so I think, it still ought to remain kind of the heartbeat, that form of solidarity and conscious objection. Because if we're acting in the name of consequences, but don't have that lifeblood, then I'm not really sure what we're doing.
Great. So on that note, I'm going to ask a different question. I was actually going to pivot more to the course, but I actually think that we've covered a bit, and I don't want to give too much away about what's going to be a course for us. I think students kind of have an idea of what they'll be getting. So to wind down, the last question I want to ask, and maybe we can just touch on it briefly because I think it opens a bit of a can of worms here, is I don't want to say $1 billion question because billionaires shouldn't exist, but let's just say the $100,000 question, or the big question, as Vasile Stanescu told me it was when we were talking about it, which is how, if we're understanding, say, veganism, even anti-speciesism as a political cause, and you're a political scientist, do you see as either the biggest hurdle, I don't know if these goes hand in hand, the biggest hurdle and the biggest pathway to reach those politically minded on the left who have not yet embraced, say, veganism or even the animal cause? And to give you a few moments to think about that question, I say that because it's interesting when you mentioned a moment ago how we see animals everywhere being exploited. I know in Dinesh Wadiwell's book, he talks about how this is the biggest labor force under capitalism. Not to mention that they are also probably maybe not the biggest, but one of the vast source of just raw materials and labor at the same time. And we also see them everywhere, right? We see bodies, we see products everywhere. But at the same time, it is so normalized that we don't see them. So I sometimes say that despite the ubiquity of animal exploitation, I can somehow understand why someone concerned with social justice still might not understand animal causes, but it's much harder for me to understand someone who is dialed into animal causes, but doesn't seem to be too concerned with human causes. Because at least they've been primed for human causes. And to see it, the animal is kind of this, right, invisibility around them. So given that, and given that you spend a lot of time dealing with race issues, class issues, and so on, what might be the best inroads in that respect? I know we've been trying to figure it out for a long time, but at this point, I'm curious.
The inroads for bringing
For bridge building to the actual concerns of those on the left who are dedicated to human justice issues.
So, sorry, just one more clarification. So the bridge that you're asking, are you asking is it a bidirectional question? Like, how do we bring animal people into the human justice fold and vice versa? Or
not the vice versa. We don't have as much, I think, time for that. But, given that we understand the history of philosophy, we understand how animals have not been on this radar, how do we start to make this? I mean, this is what advocates want to do. They want to politicize the issue. And yet there's not large scale or mass scale support even on the left. So I'm just curious. I mean, I know that, if you had that answer, we might already know about it or we already be initiating. But I'm just curious at this point where you think the most promise is.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is I've been persuaded quite a lot by our mutual friend Jan Dutkovich about, and sorry Jan if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but I've been persuaded by the necessity of thinking in terms of social infrastructure. So what are the material supports to our lives that enable animals to come in or out of view or enable us to shift that? And so that there's sort of two forms of that. So Jan is really interested in food policy, not just as the individual question of what we eat, but what kind of options are available. And so there's a whole debate over whatever you want to call it, clean or lab grown meat or whatever, that I think is relevant to this question. And another version of that, which I'm inspired by Will Campbell and Sue Donaldson, really emphasizes the need to shift the way we think about public space. We think of public space as just a purely human focused thing, but if we could make public space a more multi-species or recognize the already multi-species nature of a lot of public space, that shapes the everyday sensorium of individuals. The second thing is I think that it's both a political and kind of a philosophical issue. I think a promising area of consideration it's helpful to think about why there is this bridge beyond just surface level animals are invisibilized. So one issue is that the distinction between, say, the animal rights movement and a lot of other human social justice causes And this is that animals we're dealing with, let's say, the right to have rights for animals, whereas with some human social justice causes, it's more about rights that are unfulfilled rather than the very right to have rights itself. And so two things I think emerge from that. One is that I think, or at least personally, what I'm really interested in is the question of speech. So for humans that have unfulfilled rights, a common strategy is to have those humans speak out for themselves, right? And so we have phrases like "nothing about us without us," in which the task is to speak out. In animals obviously have very complex communicative capacities. Those communicative capacities are distinct from those that social movements have traditionally relied upon. And so I think that is a lively area of thinking through for social movement strategy, right? That is a distinction that needs to be taken account of, even if ultimately we decide it matters or doesn't matter. But like the fact that we cannot hold a microphone to a chicken and be like, what do you think about, a factory farm, requires different representational strategies that people are thinking about. But I think that is something that is sort of at the root. And part of that will also require animal advocates to, as you said, think about the history of other social movements in the US and elsewhere. And people are, I'm not trying to say that people are not doing this, but in particular, I think two social movements are worth really thinking about in depth. And I should say, by saying this, I'm not trying to draw a one-to-one analogy between these movements, but the first, inspired by my friend Claire Jean Kim, is the Black Liberation Movement, which not only is one of the most successful movements in the U.S., but has a whole history of grappling with this question of the confluence of sentience and property. And again, that has to be approached with care because there's like an unsavory history to the way the animal advocates have thought about this. But I think Dr. Kim does like a really good job of thinking through this. And then the second movement is the disability rights movement, which has grappled with the question of how do you create a social movement that for beings that have different communicative capacities than traditional, not all humans speak in the same way as other humans. And so this movement has tried to say, how do you think about the capacities of beings that are not passive, but also do not communicate in the traditional argot of social movements? So like a traditional, like a good philosopher, I don't have this is what we ought to do, but those are, that's sort of my rambly way of describing what I think the heart of, the deep root, the heart of the issue that has to be grappled with is.
Thank you for that. And I think that this will be great for the students who take the course to kind of start from really this kind of like high level philosophy, understanding how it permeates both how social movements are discussed in many ways, but then also how just the rhetoric and language of vocabulary, advertisements. I really think it does equip people to look at, say, pop media critically and say like, wow, look how much it's appealing to my embedded affection, say, for rights-based approaches or the language of rights, or how it kind of talks about suffering. I think this gives people a philosophical lens, which is also historical and contextual, of course, to approach even contemporary media. So I think it's absolutely essential. So I'm just going to wind down here. And as we do so, I really just encourage listeners to follow Jishnu's work, to enroll in this course, Foundations of Animal Ethics, which I think would be great for even kind of those philosophically curious or seasoned advocates, or even those new to advocacy and activism and are concerned with how they portray the issue to others or have those challenging kitchen table conversations around the holidays. So finally, I just want to thank you, Jishnu, for joining us on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks again. I'm really excited to teach this course and see how people respond.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.